The cabin lights glowed softly against the hum of the engines. Conversations faded into scattered whispers, and in the middle of it all sat an elderly man whose presence seemed to draw disdain from someone sworn to serve. A request as small as a cup of water should have passed without notice, yet it became the spark for a chain of cruelty that left passengers uneasy and searching for words. What no one around him realized was that their silence, their chuckles, and their willingness to let arrogance go unchecked would soon collide with a truth powerful enough to shatter the entire illusion. The moment of reckoning would not come with noise or anger, but with a revelation that turned the cabin into a stage where justice stood face to face with prejudice. Stay until the end, because this story is not what it first appears. Give this video a like, subscribe for more powerful stories, and share in the comments how you would have reacted in that moment and where you are watching from. Clarence Johnson sat quietly in his aisle seat, adjusting the cuff of his neatly pressed shirt as the engines hummed beneath the cabin. At 72, his movements carried the weight of age, but also a discipline born of decades of measured patience. He was a tall man with dignified posture, his hair silver, but his presence strong. His hands, though slightly trembling with the wear of years, still rested firmly on the armrest as he leaned forward, pressing the button to call for the flight attendant. The cabin bustled with the usual sound of shuffling passengers, the faint clinking of beverage carts, and murmurs of conversation. Clarence waited, eyes steady, his request simple and reasonable, just a glass of water. When Rebecca Miller finally approached, her polished uniform crisp and her hair tied in a tight bun, he gave her a warm nod. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said in a low, respectful voice. "May I have a cup of water, please?" He did not expect anything unusual. But instead of responding with the professional courtesy expected of her role, Rebecca paused, her eyes narrowing. She looked him up and down, lips curling in subtle disdain. Her expression wasn't one of distraction. It was deliberate, a silent judgment passed on him in that instant. Clarence, used to such glances, held his composure. Years of enduring similar treatment had trained him not to react too quickly. He waited for her acknowledgement, but she turned her head away, as if he had not spoken at all, and pushed her cart toward the row behind him. She bent down, smiling graciously at the young white couple seated there, offering them a drink menu with practiced charm. Clarence's request hung in the air, unanswered, a silence louder than any insult. Around him, a few passengers noticed the exchange. Some shrugged, assuming she was simply too busy to respond. Others, though, caught the sharp look in Rebecca's eyes and the deliberate way she chose to ignore him. Clarence shifted slightly, exhaling slowly through his nose. He could feel the familiar burn of humiliation creep into his chest, though he masked it with a calm exterior. He had lived long enough to know that the world often measured him not by his dignity, but by the color of his skin. Still, the sting of being dismissed so blatantly in front of strangers pressed against his heart. He thought of his late wife, who used to remind him to rise above such insults. Her voice echoed in his memory, urging patience, reminding him that respect was not something to beg for. It was something a man carried within himself. Rebecca's behavior, however, wasn't an isolated slip of attention. She lingered with the white passengers, laughing softly at a joke, filling their cups, handing out extra napkins. Each action emphasized the contrast between her cheerful service to them and her cold disregard for him. Clarence straightened his back, eyes fixed on the small plastic cup she poured for the man seated behind him. He could almost feel his throat dry, not from thirst, but from the weight of being so openly dismissed. He didn't speak again yet. Instead, he folded his hands in his lap, a subtle act of restraint. The hum of the plane seemed louder in that silence. Passengers shifted uncomfortably. One older woman across the aisle tilted her head, her gaze flickering between Clarence and Rebecca with concern, though she said nothing. A young boy watched too, his innocent eyes not yet trained to mask confusion. Clarence caught the child's gaze briefly and offered a faint, reassuring smile, though the heaviness in his chest deepened. He was no stranger to injustice, but there was something piercing about its presence here, thousands of feet in the air, in a space where people ought to feel safe. The act itself, denying a simple cup of water, was small, almost petty. But the cruelty in its delivery carried the sharp edge of centuries of disdain, delivered through a single woman's calculated choice to ignore him. The story of this flight was just beginning, but already the lines were being drawn. Clarence's silence was not weakness. It was the calm before something larger, the quiet dignity of a man who had endured too much to be broken by one woman's arrogance. But Rebecca's smirk, her dismissive look, was the spark that would ignite the eyes of witnesses and set the path for what was to come. "I would just like a cup of water, that's all." His words were plain, but the simple act of repeating himself stirred something in her. Rebecca's eyes snapped toward him, irritation flashing like a spark. She leaned in just enough to make her presence intimidating, her lips curling into a sneer. "Sir," she hissed through clenched teeth, her tone sharp enough for nearby passengers to hear, "don't cause trouble on this flight. Do you understand me?" Her voice, though not shouted, carried a sting that pierced through the quiet hum of the cabin. The row grew tense. A few passengers looked up from their books, earbuds, and conversations. Some frowned in confusion at the hostility in her voice. Others exchanged knowing smirks, as if entertained by the confrontation. Clarence held her gaze without flinching. His eyes, calm but unwavering, reflected not defiance, but a lifetime of refusing to be diminished. He did not raise his voice. He did not argue. He simply said, "I'm only asking for water." That quiet persistence unsettled Rebecca even more. She straightened, tossing her head back with a dismissive laugh, and turned toward the next row. As she moved away, a few chuckles erupted from across the aisle. They weren't the nervous kind. They were mocking. One man, dressed in a suit and tapping at his phone, leaned toward his companion and whispered just loud enough to be overheard, "He probably can't even afford to be in this class. Surprised he's even here." The words carried across the row like poison, sharp and casual, sinking deep. Clarence heard them, every syllable ringing in his ears, but his posture never shifted. He had endured worse in courtrooms, in restaurants, in streets where shadows lingered longer than justice. Yet still, each moment stung with its own bitterness. He thought of his grandchildren, of the stories they told him about being teased at school for their skin, for their heritage. He had told them to walk with pride, to never let others' ignorance define their worth. And here he was, forced to live his own advice in front of strangers who laughed at his dignity. Rebecca, emboldened by the scattered laughter, paused near the beverage cart to make a show of pouring drinks for the passengers who had chuckled. She gave them extra napkins, an extra smile, small rewards for sharing her disdain. Clarence's jaw tightened. He wanted to speak, to remind her that service was not a gift but a duty, that respect should not be rationed out like a favor. But he remained silent, knowing that patience had a power of its own. His silence was not surrender. It was endurance sharpened by years of being tested. The cabin's atmosphere shifted, subtle but heavy. A woman 2 rows up pressed her lips together, visibly uncomfortable. She glanced back at Clarence with sympathy, but said nothing, her eyes lowering quickly as if afraid of drawing Rebecca's ire. A teenager across the aisle pulled out his phone, his thumb hesitating over the record button. Sensing something wrong was unfolding, but unsure if capturing it would change anything. Clarence sat motionless, letting the weight of their judgment press down on him without breaking his composure. His dignity was his shield, and though battered, it held. Rebecca turned back briefly, her eyes cutting toward Clarence, and she smirked, as though daring him to press the button again. Her arrogance was a wall she had built around herself, a wall that shielded her from accountability, but also blinded her to the eyes watching her cruelty. Clarence did not rise to her bait. He simply leaned back, inhaled deeply, and folded his arms, a gesture of quiet strength. His silence did not erase the insult, but it magnified it. Those who had ears to hear could not ignore the imbalance of power, the weight of disrespect dripping from every glance and word. He chose patience, even though the dryness in his throat reminded him how simple his request had been. When Rebecca wheeled the beverage cart back down the aisle, her posture carried a deliberate smugness, as though she were eager to prove a point. She reached into the cart, pulled out a bottle of water, and unscrewed the cap in full view of Clarence. The cold plastic glistened under the cabin lights, condensation rolling down the side as though mocking him with the ease of access she withheld. Clarence's eyes followed her movement, not in desperation, but in disbelief that such cruelty could be so casually performed in front of an audience. Rebecca smiled, not at him, but at the passenger seated directly behind Clarence. She poured the water carefully into a cup, her hand steady, her voice sweetened with false courtesy. "Here you go, sir," she said warmly, handing the drink over with both hands as though she were rewarding a child. Clarence remained silent, his chest rising slowly as he inhaled, his restraint unshaken but his dignity tested. The passengers nearby could no longer pretend not to see the deliberate insult. The symbolism was too sharp to ignore. Here was a man who had asked for something so basic, denied not once but twice, and now Rebecca chose to flaunt the denial by serving someone directly behind him. The insult was not just in the refusal, it was in the performance of it, the public nature of her dismissal, a cruel display meant to reinforce her perceived superiority. It was at that moment that Michael, a young man in his late 20s seated across the aisle, leaned forward. His voice was low, almost hesitant, but clear enough to be heard. "That's not right," he whispered, his brows furrowed in disapproval. His words carried the weight of a conscience unwilling to stay silent. He had watched Rebecca's actions closely, and unlike others who laughed or turned away, he could not stomach the injustice. His whisper was meant for her ears alone, but the stillness around them made it carry farther. Several passengers glanced over, surprised that someone had spoken against her. Rebecca froze for a second, her smile faltering. She turned her head sharply, her eyes narrowing at Michael, as though he had broken some unspoken code. Her arrogance rose quickly to shield her. "Excuse me," she said in a low, clipped tone, her jaw tight with indignation. Michael didn't back down, though his voice was calm. "I saw what you did," he replied softly. "You ignored him on purpose. That's not how you treat a passenger." The words were simple, but they struck her pride. Rebecca's eyes flashed with anger, and she leaned closer, her voice sharp enough to cut. "Mind your own business," she snapped. "I don't need a lecture from you." The tension thickened, filling the row like a storm cloud about to break. Clarence turned his head slightly, looking at Michael with quiet gratitude. He didn't speak, but the faint nod he gave was enough to convey his appreciation. For the first time since boarding the plane, someone had acknowledged what was happening. Someone had dared to name the wrong aloud. That recognition was a balm against the sting of her cruelty. Yet Rebecca, determined to maintain control, pulled herself upright and crossed her arms, her voice laced with disdain. "Some people don't know how to behave when they're given privileges," she muttered, loud enough for others to hear. Her words aimed at Clarence, but meant to rally support from anyone who shared her prejudice. Her attempt at justification backfired for some. A woman too rose up, shook her head in quiet disapproval. A man in business attire glanced down at his newspaper, suddenly uncomfortable with being associated with such blatant arrogance. But a few others smirked, their silence a form of complicity, their lack of protest granting her cruelty more room to breathe. Clarence sat back in his seat, his dignity still intact though his patience frayed by the weight of so many eyes watching him suffer. He was not a man who had ever asked for pity, but the unfairness of the moment pressed heavy on his chest. He thought of the countless times he had stood in courtrooms, commanding respect with nothing more than the strength of his voice and the clarity of his judgment. To be reduced to begging for water on a flight was an insult sharper than any words Rebecca could muster. Yet he still held his silence, choosing the higher ground, knowing that time and truth would reveal more than anger ever could. Yet Rebecca, blinded by her arrogance, mistook his composure for weakness. She stood above him, her shadow falling across his shoulder as if she were claiming territory, and she leaned down just enough to let her words slice into him. "You should know your place," she said coldly, her voice sharp and deliberate, loud enough to ensure that others around them heard. There was no pretense of professionalism anymore, no mask of courtesy. Her contempt was bare, unfiltered, dripping with the confidence that no one would hold her accountable. The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some avoiding eye contact, others pretending to be absorbed in their magazines or screens. Clarence kept his head bowed, his jaw tight, the muscles in his neck straining against the storm building inside him. He did not respond. He would not give her the satisfaction of seeing him break. But his silence was not enough to shield others from the ugliness of her words. A small voice pierced the heavy air, fragile yet piercing in its honesty. From 2 rows ahead, a child no older than 7 tugged at his mother's sleeve and asked with a puzzled expression, "Mom, why does she hate that man?" The innocence of the question was like a blade cutting through the charade that passengers had built to protect their own comfort. The mother froze, her face flushed with embarrassment, not because of her child's words, but because of the truth they exposed. She leaned in quickly, shushing him, whispering something meant to distract, but it was too late. The words had landed. Every ear nearby had heard them, and the uncomfortable truth could not be ignored. Clarence lifted his eyes slowly, glancing toward the child with the faintest smile, not of joy, but of recognition. Children saw what adults tried to disguise. They named injustice plainly, without fear of etiquette or consequence. That small question carried more power than any accusation because it revealed the cruelty for what it was. Rebecca stiffened, her face tightening, her confidence rattled by the exposure. For a brief second her eyes darted toward the mother and child, but she quickly forced a thin smile, trying to pretend as if she had not been caught. Yet the damage was already done. The nearby passengers could no longer claim ignorance. They had heard her cruelty, they had seen her disdain, and now they had to face the raw, unfiltered truth spoken by a child too young to lie. The air in the cabin grew heavy. The laughter that had once accompanied her mistreatment now vanished, replaced by a suffocating silence that pressed on everyone. Clarence took a slow breath, his shoulders rising and falling with the rhythm of restraint. He could feel the tide turning, not in his favor yet, but away from her unchecked arrogance. He remembered the countless times in his life when change had begun with a small crack in the wall of oppression, sometimes a word, sometimes a look, sometimes a question too innocent to be ignored. He sat taller now, his back straightened, his silence no longer a retreat, but a statement of strength. His eyes met Rebecca's briefly, and though he said nothing, the weight of his gaze carried meaning. He would not forget her words. He would not let them define him. And he knew now that others had heard, others had seen, and silence would no longer be her shield. Rebecca turned sharply, her heels clicking against the aisle floor, trying to regain her composure by moving away, pretending to focus on other passengers. But the echo of her words followed her down the row, sticking like a stain that no forced smile could erase. Some passengers whispered now, their voices low but filled with unease. Others shook their heads subtly, their expressions marked with quiet disgust. Clarence remained still, but inside he felt the shift. He knew cruelty often grew bold when unchallenged, but now, with one innocent question, the entire cabin had been reminded of what was truly unfolding. He had been taught to carry himself with patience, but he also knew when to take small steps to ease his own discomfort. He reached slowly for the overhead compartment, his movements careful and deliberate, the way a man his age always moved with thoughtfulness. He stood, his tall frame rising with quiet dignity, his hand stretching upward to retrieve the light jacket that had been resting above him. His action was not sudden, not aggressive, not disruptive, just an elderly man seeking warmth against the cold air swirling inside the plane. But Rebecca seized the moment like a predator spotting prey. Her eyes widened theatrically, and her voice rose above the hum of the engines, sharp and commanding, designed to draw every gaze toward Clarence. "Sit down immediately," she barked. "You're disrupting the flight." The accusation sliced through the cabin, startling passengers who knew full well that Clarence had done nothing but retrieve a jacket. Yet the power of her voice carried the weight of authority, and authority misused has a way of reshaping perception. Passengers turned their heads, some gasping, some frowning, others unsure whether to believe her tone or their own eyes. Clarence paused mid-motion, his hand resting on the jacket, his back straightening slowly as he turned his head toward her. His face remained calm, though the years of injustice echoed in the silence between his breath and his reply. But before he could even lower himself back into his seat, Rebecca raised her hand to the intercom panel, as though ready to escalate further. Her voice dripped with false indignation, loud enough to reverberate across the cabin. "This passenger is non-compliant," she announced sharply. "If necessary, I'll report him to the captain right now." Her words crackled like fire across dry grass, sparking whispers and murmurs among passengers who had seen everything unfold. Clarence stood frozen for a moment, his jacket now in his hand, his expression unreadable, but his eyes filled with the burden of carrying yet another false accusation. He lowered himself slowly into his seat, his every movement deliberate, dignified, refusing to allow her narrative to twist his actions into something violent. He laid the jacket across his lap, smoothing the fabric with his hands, as if to ground himself against the absurdity of being painted as a threat. Whispers floated through the rows. "He just got a jacket," one man muttered under his breath. "That's all he did." Another voice, softer but edged with concern, replied, "She's exaggerating. You saw how she's been treating him." But others remained silent, their eyes downcast, unwilling to challenge the authority of a flight attendant whose word held power in the air. Clarence's silence again became his shield, though this time it was not only for dignity but for survival. He knew that in enclosed spaces like this, words from the wrong lips could spiral into consequences far beyond reason. He had lived long enough to understand that false accusations often carried more weight than truth, especially when spoken by someone wearing a uniform. Rebecca, emboldened by the sound of her own voice, planted her hands firmly on her hips. She looked down at Clarence, as though she were a warden keeping a prisoner in line, her eyes filled with arrogance. "One more outburst," she declared loudly, "and you'll be removed when we land. Do you understand me?" The venom in her tone drew audible discomfort from some passengers, a few shifting uneasily in their seats. Michael, who had already spoken up once, clenched his fists in frustration but held his tongue, calculating the risk of further confrontation. His jaw tightened as he watched Rebecca spin her false narrative, his eyes darting between Clarence's composed silence and the faces of passengers who either looked away or stared with wide, uneasy eyes. The child who had spoken earlier tugged at his mother's sleeve again. "But Mom," he whispered, his little voice breaking through the tense quiet. "He didn't do anything." The mother's eyes brimmed with conflict as she hushed him, torn between protecting her child and acknowledging the truth aloud. Clarence heard the boy's words, and though his heart carried the weight of insult, a flicker of warmth passed through him. Even in silence, truth had witnesses. Rebecca's threat lingered, but Clarence knew this was not the end. He adjusted the jacket on his lap, his movements slow, steady, purposeful. He would not allow her words to strip him of the self-respect he carried into every room, every courtroom, every place where justice had once been his calling. He looked up briefly, meeting the eyes of Michael across the aisle. That silent exchange spoke volumes. Michael's eyes carried anger and solidarity, while Clarence's gaze returned patience and resolve. It was then that a voice rose from a row across the aisle, firm but calm, carrying the courage that others had lacked. Linda Parker, a woman in her mid-40s with sharp eyes and the kind of presence that carried authority even without a uniform, leaned forward. "Excuse me," she said, her voice loud enough to carry several rows. "I've been watching, and that man hasn't done a single thing wrong. He just got his jacket. That's it. You can't accuse him of disrupting the flight." Her words landed like stones in still water, rippling through the cabin. Heads turned toward her, some with relief that someone had finally spoken, others with fear that her defiance might draw Rebecca's wrath. Clarence slowly turned his head, his eyes softening with gratitude, though he said nothing. His fists remained tight, but his heart eased just slightly knowing someone else was willing to break the silence. Rebecca's face hardened instantly, the mask of professional politeness gone, replaced with the sharp glare of someone who had been challenged in her own domain. She spun toward Linda, her voice rising to a shrill pitch that carried over the hum of the engines. "Stay out of this," she snapped. This passenger is already on thin ice, and if you continue to interfere, I'll make sure security is waiting for both of you when we land." The threat was loud, deliberate, designed not just to silence Linda, but to warn every other passenger watching that standing up for Clarence would come at a cost. Her tone dripped with arrogance, fueled by the belief that her authority in the cabin was absolute. But Linda did not shrink back. Her voice remained calm, though her words were edged with steel. "I'm not interfering," she replied firmly. "I'm stating the truth. You've humiliated him since the moment he asked for water, and now you're threatening him for doing nothing. That's not how this works. We're not blind." Her words drew murmurs among passengers. A few nodded in quiet agreement, others whispered to their neighbors, their discomfort growing as Rebecca's behavior became harder to justify. The thin thread of complicity that had kept them silent began to fray. Clarence felt a rush of conflicting emotions as he listened. On one hand, Linda's defense was a balm, a reminder that justice still had a voice even in places where arrogance sought to drown it out. On the other, the thought of Rebecca's threat lingered in his mind. He knew all too well how quickly authority could twist words, how easily a false accusation could snowball into real consequences. He clenched his fists tighter, his knuckles whitening as the memory of past battles fought in courtrooms and boardrooms surged within him. He had won those battles with reason and law, but here, confined in a metal tube thousands of feet in the air, reason seemed fragile, vulnerable to the venom of Rebecca's voice. Rebecca's threat shifted the cabin atmosphere again, her arrogance filling the space, but cracks were showing. The very confidence with which she tried to silence dissent exposed her insecurity. Passengers who had laughed earlier now shifted uncomfortably, no longer finding humor in watching an old man maligned. A young woman 2 seats behind Clarence whispered, "She's out of line," to her companion, who nodded quickly, though neither dared to speak aloud. The child who had asked his mother a question earlier now watched with wide, unblinking eyes, his innocence struggling to understand why an adult in uniform would act with such cruelty. Clarence sat still, the jacket heavy on his lap, his fists tight, his silence more powerful than words. He did not rise to Rebecca's provocation, did not allow her threats to dictate his actions. He had endured much in life, but this moment tested the core of his self-control. His dignity was intact, but inside he felt a pull of frustration, the anger that burned against the wall of his restraint. He thought of his late wife again, her voice reminding him to breathe, to carry himself with honor even when honor was denied. He thought of his children and grandchildren, who would one day hear this story, and he knew the example he set mattered more than the insult he bore. She picked up another bottle of water, and though her face carried the mask of professional duty, her eyes betrayed a darker intent. With deliberate slowness, she poured a cup, the liquid sloshing against the rim, and she turned as though to hand it forward. But instead, with a flick of her wrist masked as clumsiness, the cold water cascaded downward, splattering across Clarence's shirt and dripping onto his lap. The chill of the liquid struck his chest, soaking through the thin fabric, spreading wet patches across his torso. He flinched slightly, not from fear, but from the shock of the cold water seeping against his skin. The humiliation, however, stung more sharply than the cold. Rebecca gasped theatrically, pressing her hand against her chest in mock surprise. "Oh dear, I'm so sorry," she said in a tone that carried no real apology, only the smug satisfaction of a predator playing with his prey. Her smirk was faint but unmistakable, curling at the edge of her lips before she quickly masked it beneath a veneer of false professionalism. Clarence sat motionless, staring down at the spreading stain on his shirt, his jaw tightening, his hands returning to fists once more. He felt the eyes of passengers burning into him, some in sympathy, others in curiosity, a few still pretending not to notice. But the cruelty was undeniable now, too deliberate, too precise to be dismissed as chance. He lifted his eyes slowly, locking them onto Rebecca's, his silence louder than words, his dignity intact even as his shirt clung wetly to his chest. The years of injustice he had endured had prepared him for this, but the pain of watching such behavior continue in front of an audience weighed heavily. He could endure the insult for himself, But he thought of the child who had spoken earlier, the young passengers watching, and he knew what they were learning from her cruelty. That thought carved deeper than the water, soaking his shirt. Michael, who had restrained himself earlier after Rebecca dismissed his whisper, now leaned forward sharply, his patience snapping. His fists clenched at the armrest as he stared at Rebecca, his eyes ablaze with anger. "That wasn't an accident," he muttered loudly enough for those around him to hear. "You did that on purpose." His words carried the weight of a man unwilling to let silence serve as complicity. The tension snapped further as he reached above him, pressing the small round call button overhead. The familiar chime echoed through the cabin, drawing the attention of every nearby passenger, cutting through the oppressive silence like a blade. Rebecca's face flushed red, her smirk faltering for a moment as the chime confirmed that others would soon come to this row. She glanced at Michael, her lips tightening into a thin, forced smile. "You don't know what you're talking about," she snapped quietly, her tone defensive but still edged with arrogance. Michael did not back down. His voice carried, stronger this time. "Everyone saw it," he said firmly. "You poured it right on him. That's not service, that's harassment." His words emboldened others who had sat in silence. A few passengers nodded, their expressions stern, their whispers echoing through the rows. Clarence sat still, his soaked shirt clinging, his silence deliberate, his presence commanding more authority in stillness than Rebecca carried in her loud words. The sound of the call button chime lingered, a signal that the balance was shifting. For too long Rebecca had wielded her authority unchecked, but now witnesses were aligning, voices were rising, and the narrative she had spun so confidently was unraveling. She tried to regain composure, turning sharply to the cart as though to distract herself with busywork, but her movements betrayed her agitation. The passengers who had once laughed or whispered against Clarence now stared with discomfort at her transparent cruelty. Silence no longer served her. The truth was visible, undeniable, and Clarence's soaked shirt was a physical testament to the malice she had tried to disguise as clumsiness. Clarence adjusted his jacket over his chest, his movements slow and deliberate, covering the wet patches with a dignity that refused to allow her satisfaction to linger. He would not flail. He would not argue. His silence was not submission. It was a statement, one that said he had nothing to prove to a woman whose cruelty only revealed her own weakness. He sat taller now, his chin lifting slightly, his posture regal even in humiliation. Rebecca's attempt to demean him had only magnified the strength of his composure. Murmurs lingered in the air, and Clarence sat silently with his jacket draped across his soaked shirt, his posture dignified yet marked by the visible insult of what had just been done to him. Daniel approached with a steady gaze, his eyes scanning Clarence, Rebecca, and Michael, then sweeping across the onlookers who leaned toward the aisle, eager to see what would happen. "What seems to be the issue here?" he asked in a firm but neutral tone. Before Clarence could part his lips, Rebecca lunged into the silence, her words spilling fast and loud, trying to seize control of the narrative. "This gentleman," she said sharply, pointing toward Clarence, "has been causing disruption since we boarded. He has been difficult, making unreasonable demands, and now passengers are interfering. It's becoming a disturbance." Her voice was high-clipped, designed to overwhelm, and she gestured wildly as if painting Clarence as a figure of chaos. But her words clashed with the still dignity of the man she maligned. Passengers glanced at one another, shaking their heads discreetly, silently disagreeing with her. Daniel raised a hand, his expression tightening at Rebecca's barrage. "I'd like to hear directly from him," he said firmly, cutting her off. His eyes shifted to Clarence, and the hush that fell over the cabin was palpable. Clarence looked up slowly, his eyes calm but filled with the deep weariness of a man who had carried this burden too long. He opened his mouth, his voice steady, low, and heavy with truth. "I asked for a cup of water," he said simply. He paused, letting the words settle in the tense air before he added, "And I've endured this my entire life." The sentence carried no theatrics, no anger, no embellishment, yet its weight sank into the cabin like an anchor. Passengers who had been shifting in discomfort froze, their eyes fixed on him, their guilt and unease reflecting the truth they had witnessed, but not all had spoken against. Even Daniel, trained to remain neutral, felt the heaviness of those words in his chest. Rebecca sputtered, her face flushing as she scrambled to regain control. "He's exaggerating," she said, her voice trembling slightly now. "He's imagining things, taking my words out of context. He's twisting it. He's making me look bad." The desperation behind her tone was evident, the cracks in her arrogance widening. Michael leaned forward, his voice cutting across hers. "No, we saw it," he said firmly, addressing Daniel directly. She ignored him, mocked him, accused him of causing trouble, when all he did was get his jacket. And she poured water on him on purpose. Linda added her voice without hesitation, strong and unshaken. "That's right. Everything he said is true. She's been cruel from the start. Everyone in this section knows it." Other passengers nodded, their silence breaking as the truth began to form a chorus. Rebecca's eyes darted desperately across the cabin, seeking support, but the faces that met her gaze were no longer amused or complicit. They were condemning. She folded her arms, her lips pressed tightly together, retreating into the brittle shell of denial. Clarence remained seated, his gaze still fixed on Daniel, his words hanging in the air with quiet force. "I've endured this my entire life." The sentence echoed in Daniel's mind, forcing him to look beyond the narrow context of this flight. He saw not just an elderly man with a wet shirt, but the embodiment of years of disregard, the truth of a life lived under constant scrutiny, insult, and dismissal. The child's voice rose again, small but piercing. "She's lying," the boy said, his innocence carrying the sharp edge of undeniable truth. His mother hushed him quickly, her cheeks flushed, but her eyes met Clarence's with a silent apology. The honesty of the boy's statement silenced even Rebecca, whose attempt at denial now felt paper-thin. Clarence nodded slightly, acknowledging the child's courage, and leaned back into his seat. His silence after those words was not emptiness. It was filled with the weight of history, of patience stretched to breaking, of a man who had long ago learned that sometimes one line, spoken at the right moment, carried more power than an hour of argument. Rebecca stood stiff behind her cart, her eyes darting across the rows as though searching for an escape route from the trap she had built for herself. Her jaw clenched, her cheeks flushed, her chest rising and falling with quick, shallow breaths that betrayed her simmering panic. She could feel her grip on authority slipping, and desperation began to feed her arrogance further. Clarence, by contrast, sat in silence, his jacket draped across his wet shirt, his posture regal even in humiliation, his restraint commanding more respect than any shouted word ever could. He closed his eyes briefly, his fingers tapping gently against the armrest, steadying his breath as though reminding himself that endurance was its own form of power. As the murmurs among passengers began to swell, a shift occurred further up the cabin. A woman seated in business class had turned in her seat at the sound of his voice. She was elegant, dressed in a tailored suit that marked her as a professional of influence, and her eyes widened as she recognized the man seated several rows behind. She had seen him once before, years earlier, at a courthouse where his rulings had been lauded for fairness and courage. Her mouth parted slightly in shock, her heart racing with the realization that the man being humiliated was none other than Judge Clarence Johnson, a figure whose name carried weight and respect across legal and civic communities. She half rose from her seat, her hand gripping the headrest, her voice forming on her lips as if to call out his name. But Clarence's eyes opened at that very moment, and he lifted his hand in a subtle gesture, a faint shake of his head, signaling her to remain silent. Their eyes met briefly, a silent understanding passing between them. He was not ready for the truth of his identity to be revealed. Not yet. The time for that would come, but not here, not in a way that might look like a plea for rescue. Rebecca, unaware of the recognition that had flickered across the rows, tightened her grip on the cart, her thoughts racing. Her authority was eroding, her lies cracking under the weight of witnesses and truth. Fear clawed at her pride, but pride is a dangerous weapon in desperate hands. She took a deep breath, steadied her trembling voice, and then raised it again, her words sharp and venomous, designed to turn suspicion back on Clarence. "He's been harassing women on this flight," she declared loudly, her voice slicing through the uneasy quiet. "His behavior has made female passengers uncomfortable, and I won't tolerate it any longer." The accusation exploded in the cabin like a spark thrown into dry tinder. Passengers gasped, some turning sharply toward Clarence, others toward Rebecca, their faces etched with disbelief. Clarence froze, his shoulders stiff, his eyes narrowing at the sheer audacity of the lie. His fists clenched once more, the veins along his hand rising as his patience strained to its very edge. It was one thing to endure disrespect, another to be humiliated with spilled water, but to be accused of harassment, a charge that could ruin reputations and carry consequences far beyond this flight, was a cruelty that cut to the bone. Yet still, he did not rise, did not shout, did not give her the satisfaction of seeing him crack. He sat in silence, his chest rising with controlled breaths, his eyes burning with the weight of a man who had carried injustice too long to be surprised by its depths. Michael's voice broke the silence, sharp and outraged. "That's a lie," he shouted, his voice carrying down the aisle. "He hasn't harassed anyone. He hasn't even spoken to anyone except you. We've all been watching. You're the one causing all of this." His words hit like hammers, and Linda quickly joined in, her tone steady and unflinching. "She's lying. I've sat here the entire time, and I can tell you without hesitation that this man has done nothing but sit quietly. He has not harassed anyone." She's twisting the truth again. Their voices gave strength to others, and murmurs rose from different parts of the cabin. "She's out of line," one man muttered. "This is too much," another whispered. Heads shook, lips pursed, eyes fixed on Rebecca with growing condemnation. But Rebecca pushed forward, her arrogance swelling even as her credibility shattered. "Of course you're defending him," she snapped, glaring at Michael and Linda. "You're part of this disruption. You don't understand how serious this is. I have the authority here, and if you keep defending him, you'll face consequences too." Her words cracked with desperation, her eyes flashing wildly as she tried to cling to control. Yet with every word, her grip slipped further, the passenger's disapproval deepening, her lies unraveling beneath the weight of too many witnesses. Then, as if to answer the tension that hung heavy over every seat, the curtain near the cockpit pulled back once again. This time it was not the co-pilot who stepped forward. It was Captain Daniel Harris, the pilot himself, a man whose presence carried the weight of command not only over the flight, but over the truth of what had unfolded. His uniform was immaculate, his stride deliberate, his eyes sharp with the authority of a man accustomed to command. When the captain entered the cabin, silence rippled through the rows. Conversations hushed, whispers died, and every eye turned to him. Even Rebecca straightened quickly, her posture rigid, her face morphing into the mask of professionalism she had discarded so long ago. She pasted on a smile that trembled faintly at the edges, the kind of smile meant to curry favor and erase suspicion. Captain Harris stopped in the aisle just a few feet from Clarence's row, his gaze sweeping across the passengers, his voice carrying a steady authority. "I've been receiving multiple reports from this section," he said firmly. "I want to know exactly what is going on." His tone was calm but edged with steel, the tone of a man who had no patience for games. Clarence lifted his head slightly, prepared to speak, but Rebecca moved faster, her voice rushing into the space before he could claim it. "Captain," she began, her tone sugary sweet, her smile wide but forced, "thank goodness you've come. I've been trying to keep order back here, but some passengers are interfering, and one in particular has been, well, less than cooperative. I've only been doing my job trying to maintain peace, but my authority keeps being undermined." Her words were dripping with flattery, her tone a desperate attempt to align herself with him, to present herself as the faithful guardian of order while shifting suspicion toward Clarence. She even dared to glance at him with a look of wounded innocence, as though she were the one enduring cruelty, not the one dealing it. Passengers shifted in disbelief, their eyes darting from her false performance to the silent dignity of Clarence, sitting soaked in his seat. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Clarence's shirt still bore the stain of spilled water beneath his jacket, his composure unshaken even as his character was maligned. Rebecca's smile, too wide and too false, betrayed the desperation clinging to her words. Captain Harris's eyes narrowed as he studied her. He had flown for years, had dealt with unruly passengers, emergencies, and challenges of every kind, and his instincts were finely tuned to detect dishonesty. Something in her tone rang false. Something in the forced sweetness of her voice clashed with the tense expressions of those seated around her. His gaze shifted slowly toward Clarence, who met it steadily, without flinching, his silence more powerful than any hurried protest could have been. The captain let the silence hang for a moment, as though weighing the truth in the air between them. Rebecca, panicking at his silence, rushed to fill it. "Captain, please understand," she continued, her hands gesturing animatedly. "I take my responsibilities very seriously. This gentleman has been standing when he shouldn't, raising his voice, and," she hesitated just slightly, searching for a word that would carry enough weight, "and making some of the women on board uncomfortable. I was only protecting the other passengers, as I should. I know how important safety and comfort are under your command." Her words were designed to appeal to his pride, to his responsibility, but her voice wavered at the edges, betraying the fragility of her narrative. Michael leaned forward before Clarence could even open his mouth. "Captain, with respect, that's not true," he said loudly, his voice filled with conviction. "She's been humiliating him since the start. He asked for water, and she ignored him. He stood to get his jacket, and she called him non-compliant. She poured water on him deliberately. Everyone here saw it. She's lying to you right now." Linda followed quickly, her voice steady and resolute. "He hasn't harassed anyone. He hasn't disrupted anything. He's been quiet this whole time. The only disruption has been her." Others began murmuring again, voices rising in agreement, the chorus of truth growing louder, impossible to drown out. From 2 rows back, a man in his 30s stood slightly, holding up his phone in one hand. His expression was tense but resolute as he said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Captain, I've been recording everything since she first snapped at him. It's all here, her ignoring him, mocking him, accusing him falsely, and pouring water on him. Everything is on video." His words sent a visible shockwave through the cabin. Passengers turned their heads quickly, some gasping, others nodding in affirmation. The captain's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening, and he motioned for the man to bring the phone forward. Rebecca's head snapped toward the passenger, her eyes flashing with panic. "You can't record on flights without permission," she barked, her voice breaking with desperation. But her protest sounded hollow against the weight of so many eyes and so much truth. The man ignored her outburst and extended the phone toward the captain. Passengers around them chimed in, their voices rising like a chorus of justice. "She's lying, we saw it," one woman declared. "He never did anything wrong," another insisted. A man across the aisle shook his head, his voice heavy with anger. "She humiliated him for no reason. It was deliberate. We all watched it happen." Linda added her voice too, strong and unwavering, reminding the captain of every moment she had seen. Michael leaned forward, his voice sharp. "It's not just about water. It's about respect. He asked for something simple, and she treated him like he was nothing." The collective voices rose higher and higher, drowning out Rebecca's sputtering protests. Her face paled, the mask stripped away, the arrogance gone, replaced with the undeniable truth that the crowd was no longer on her side. Captain Harris raised his hand, commanding silence once more. The voices lowered, but the tension still vibrated in the air, thick and alive. He looked at the man holding the phone, glanced briefly at the screen as it replayed Rebecca's words, her smirk, the deliberate spill of water. His eyes hardened as he took in what he saw. Then he turned slowly, his gaze fixing on Clarence. The weight of command shifted from judgment to inquiry, and the cabin stilled again. "Sir," he said firmly, his voice softened just slightly with respect, "I want to hear from you directly. Tell me what happened here." The cabin leaned into the moment, dozens of pairs of eyes trained on Clarence as he lifted his chin, his posture regal even in weariness. His voice came low, steady, filled with the deep patience of a man who had endured the world's indifference too long to waste words now. "I only asked for a glass of water," he said. The simplicity of the line struck the cabin like a hammer against glass. It shattered the lies, stripped away the noise, and laid bare the cruel absurdity of what had been done to him. His voice carried no bitterness, no self-pity. It was soft, almost weary, but its resonance filled every heart that heard it. The passengers who had spoken up earlier fell silent, their eyes moist, their expressions heavy with the realization of how small his request had been and how monumental the injustice that had followed. The child from earlier whispered to his mother again, this time softer. "That's all he wanted?" His mother nodded, unable to speak, her eyes glistening with shame for the cruelty her son had been forced to witness. Rebecca froze, her mouth opening but no words coming out. The absurdity of her accusations lay exposed in the face of that simple truth. All her fabrications, claims of disruption, of noncompliance, of harassment, dissolved in an instant, defeated by the calm honesty of an elderly man who had asked for nothing more than a basic courtesy. Captain Harris's eyes lingered on Clarence, and for the first time his face softened with something beyond command, respect. He turned back toward Rebecca, his tone sharp and cold. "That's all he asked for? A glass of water?" The weight in his voice made Rebecca's lips tremble. "Why, yes, but," she stammered, her words crumbling in her throat. The captain raised his hand to silence her, his authority final. The murmurs swelled again, but this time they carried not confusion, not uncertainty, but clarity. The passengers knew the truth, and it was simple, undeniable, impossible to twist. Her pride, backed into a corner and threatened by the undeniable weight of witnesses and evidence, lashed out in one last desperate strike. Her face flushed red, her hands trembling slightly, but she lifted her chin high, her lips curling into a sneer that carried both venom and denial. She pointed at Clarence with a gesture of contempt, her voice rising so sharply that passengers in the back rows turned to look. "He's just some old black man," she spat. "Who would believe him over me?" The words landed like a knife, slicing through the cabin's thin air, their ugliness echoing with a brutality that no one could pretend not to hear. Gasps erupted around her, passengers recoiling as though struck themselves. Even those who had tried to remain neutral now stared at her in open disgust. The rawness of her prejudice was no longer hidden behind excuses or accusations. It was laid bare, naked in its cruelty. Clarence did not flinch. His eyes remained steady, his face impassive, though inside the sting of those words cut deep into wounds he had carried for decades. He inhaled slowly, deliberately, choosing silence once again, not because he was defeated, but because he understood that truth always revealed itself more powerfully than anger ever could. Linda Parker, who had defended him earlier, felt something ignite within her. She had remained composed until now, her words measured, her tone steady, but hearing Rebecca's open contempt shattered any hesitation she had left. She rose halfway from her seat, her hand gripping the headrest before her, her eyes blazing with righteous anger. Her voice carried across the cabin, strong, unshaken, filled with conviction. "That man," she declared, pointing toward Clarence, "is not just some old black man. That man is Judge Clarence Johnson, a retired federal judge who taught me during my clerkship. I studied under him. He is one of the most respected men I've ever known. And you," her voice trembled with indignation, "you have treated him like dirt." The declaration stunned the cabin into silence. Passengers gasped, their eyes widening, their whispers buzzing like electricity through the rows. Those who had suspected he was more than he appeared now had confirmation. Clarence Johnson, federal judge, a man whose name had graced news articles, whose rulings had been discussed in legal journals, whose integrity had once stood as a shield for the vulnerable, was seated before them, soaked in water, humiliated by a flight attendant who had wielded prejudice like a weapon. Rebecca's face drained of color as the words hit her. Her smirk faltered, her jaw slackened, her eyes darting wildly across the passengers as though searching for someone to deny what Linda had said. But the determination in Linda's tone left no room for doubt. Michael sat forward, his face lit with vindication. "I knew it," he muttered, his voice filled with awe and anger. The business class passenger, who had earlier recognized Clarence's face, now nodded vigorously, adding her voice from up front. "She's telling the truth. I've seen his face in court reports. That is Judge Johnson." Her words, carried back through the cabin, sealed the revelation in stone. Passengers began murmuring louder, their disbelief turning into outrage, their shame at having witnessed his humiliation boiling over into something heavier, anger directed squarely at Rebecca. Clarence himself shifted slightly, his hand lifting to signal for silence once more. His eyes found Linda's, and he offered a faint nod, a silent acknowledgement of gratitude, but also a reminder of his restraint. He had not chosen to reveal himself yet, had preferred to endure in silence, but now the truth was out, exposed not by his own words, but by the courage of another who could no longer bear to hear him degraded. His voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet but carried enough weight to hush the growing murmurs. "I never needed them to know who I was," he said softly, his eyes fixed on Rebecca. "But now they do, and that makes what you've done even clearer." Rebecca staggered backward slightly, her composure crumbling. The arrogance that had fueled her cruelty dissolved in the face of his identity. Her earlier words, her mockery, her accusations, now looked pitiful, reckless, unforgivable. She shook her head weakly, stammering, I didn't know, I didn't realize," but the excuses sounded hollow, and the cabin erupted in voices that drowned her out. Passengers condemned her, their words sharp, their tones fierce. "Shame on you. Disgusting. You treated a federal judge like that?" Their outrage was not just about Clarence's title, but about the realization that prejudice had driven her from the start. The title only magnified the gravity of her cruelty. Captain Harris stood rooted in the aisle, his face grim, his eyes darkened with anger. He turned toward Rebecca, his voice low but cutting. "I don't care who he is," he said. "No one deserves to be treated the way you've treated this passenger. But the fact that you thought you could say those words about a man of his stature, about any man, on my flight, that is beyond disgraceful." His tone silenced even the murmurs, his authority final, unshakable. Rebecca opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. She lowered her gaze to the floor, her shoulders slumping as the reality of her actions finally cornered her completely. A man in the middle row leaned toward his wife, whispering urgently, "He's the judge who ruled against that discriminatory housing policy years ago." Another woman near the front clutched her chest, her voice trembling as she told her teenage son, "I remember his name. He was the one who stood up for those workers. They called his ruling historic." The boy, wide-eyed, stared back at Clarence with newfound respect, the weight of recognition settling on him. The hum of conversation swelled as passengers traded fragments of what they remembered, each voice weaving together the portrait of a man who had once held the scales of justice steady when others tried to tilt them. Clarence remained still, his eyes lowered, his hands folded neatly over his jacket. He had not asked for recognition, had not wanted the power of his name to be the shield that saved him here. Yet now, as the murmurs of respect spread through the cabin, he felt the shift in power growing undeniable. He could hear pieces of his life being repeated back to him, events he had long since left behind, but which still lived in the memories of strangers. His rulings had once changed the lives of thousands, but here, on this plane, his request had been nothing more than a simple glass of water. The contrast burned inside him, sharp and bitter, reminding him of the fragility of dignity in the hands of those who chose arrogance over respect. Rebecca stood rigid near the cart, her face pale, her breathing shallow. The revelation had struck her like a blow, her arrogance crumbling as she realized she had not just insulted an elderly passenger, but a man whose name was tied to justice itself. Yet desperation is the last refuge of the arrogant, and she quickly straightened her back, forcing a smile onto her lips, though her eyes betrayed panic. "That may be who he was," she said loudly, her voice trembling with a blend of fear and defiance. "But the past has nothing to do with this flight. His rulings, his career, they don't matter here. Right now, he is just another passenger, and I was only trying to keep order." Her words fell heavy and hollow, echoing with the futility of someone who knew the ground beneath them was collapsing. The passengers erupted in protest, their voices louder than ever before. "Don't you dare," one man snapped. "Don't you dare try to minimize who he is." A woman across the aisle glared at Rebecca, her eyes ablaze with anger. "You humiliated him over water. You called him names. You poured water on him deliberately. And now you think his past doesn't matter? You're wrong. His past matters because it shows the truth about him, and it shows the truth about you." The crowd of voices swelled, unified in their condemnation. The tide fully turned against her. For the first time since the ordeal began, Clarence was no longer the only bearer of his dignity. The passengers had become his defense, their outrage rising to shield him, their voices tearing apart the flimsy excuses Rebecca tried to cling to. Michael leaned forward again, his voice cutting through the noise with sharp clarity. "You tried to call him disruptive. You tried to call him non-compliant. You even accused him of harassment. And now we find out he is a federal judge, a man who spent his life protecting others from people exactly like you. His past is the only thing that matters here because it proves beyond doubt that you lied." Linda's voice followed, steady and unshaken, carrying the authority of truth. "She's right. I learned under Judge Johnson. I know his integrity. If this flight had been a courtroom, her lies would have collapsed within minutes. And that's exactly what is happening here." Rebecca's forced smile faltered, her lips twitching as the weight of their words pressed down on her. She looked to Captain Harris, desperate for support, but the captain's face was stone, his eyes dark with disapproval. He had seen enough, heard enough, and her attempt to sever Clarence from his past had only revealed her desperation more clearly. The child from earlier, who had asked innocent questions that cut sharper than any adult's words, tugged again at his mother's sleeve. "Mom," he whispered loudly enough for others to hear. How could she hate a judge who helps people? His mother, her voice heavy with emotion, answered quietly, "Because some people don't care who you are. They only see what they want to see." Clarence finally lifted his head, his eyes sweeping the cabin slowly, his gaze filled not with triumph but with sorrowful patience. His voice, when it came, was steady, calm, yet filled with the gravity of truth. "I did not want my name to protect me," he said softly. "I wanted the dignity of being treated as a man, nothing more. Not a judge, not a title. Just a man who asked for a cup of water." His words silenced the murmurs instantly, striking deeper than any revelation about his past could. Passengers bowed their heads slightly, shame and admiration mingling in the silence that followed. His voice had stripped the situation back to its essence, reminding them all that justice was not about who he had been, but about the simple respect owed to every human being. Rebecca, pale and trembling, gripped the cart in front of her as though it were the last anchor keeping her upright. Her smile had vanished, replaced with a tight grimace, and her eyes darted from face to face, searching desperately for even a shred of support. None came. The passengers who had once chuckled at Clarence's humiliation now avoided her gaze, their expressions turned cold with disapproval. Others stared openly, their anger unmasked. The tide had fully turned. Captain Harris stood tall in the aisle, his eyes locked on Rebecca. His face was stern, carved with the authority of command, and when he spoke, his voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Rebecca Miller," he said clearly, his tone sharp, final, and impossible to misunderstand. "You are relieved of duty immediately." The words carried across the cabin, each syllable echoing with finality. Passengers gasped, some leaning forward as if to catch every word, others exhaling in relief that the injustice they had endured watching was finally being confronted with real consequence. Rebecca's mouth opened in protest, but no sound came. Her throat tightened, her lips trembled, and her face flushed as the reality of her disgrace set in. The captain did not give her room to argue. His voice hardened further, filled with authority and moral weight. "This passenger deserves respect," he declared, gesturing toward Clarence. All passengers deserve respect, no matter who they are, no matter where they come from, no matter what they ask for. What you have done is unacceptable, and it will not continue under my command." His words thundered through the rows, igniting something in the passengers that had been waiting to break free. The sound began slowly, a scattered clap from one side of the cabin, then another, and then it spread like fire through dry brush. Applause filled the plane, rolling forward and backward, passengers clapping vigorously, their faces lit with satisfaction, their voices joining in cheers of approval. The sound of unity, of justice acknowledged, drowned out everything else. Clarence sat still, his chest rising with a slow breath, his eyes lowered as if he carried the applause not as triumph, but as vindication for dignity itself. He had not asked for this. He had only asked for water. Yet now he was the center of the cabin's applause, the embodiment of patience turned into justice, his silence transformed into power. He lifted his head slightly, his gaze sweeping across the rows, acknowledging the passengers who had stood for truth, who had finally found their voices when silence no longer sufficed. His nod was faint, but it carried meaning, a gesture that said he accepted their recognition, but also reminded them that justice was not applause. It was action, respect, and accountability. Rebecca, still rooted to the floor, shook her head as tears of frustration welled in her eyes. She whispered a broken protest. "I was only doing my job," but the words fell flat, drowned beneath the applause and overshadowed by the evidence of her cruelty. Captain Harris pointed toward an empty passenger seat near the back. "You will sit down for the remainder of this flight as a passenger," he ordered. "You will not serve. You will not speak. And when we land, there will be a full report of your conduct." The steel in his voice left no room for negotiation. Rebecca, her pride shattered, turned slowly and shuffled down the aisle, each step heavy, each glance from passengers a silent judgment. She sat stiffly in the seat, her uniform suddenly no shield, her authority stripped from her shoulders. The applause continued, passengers turning toward Clarence with admiration, some even calling out words of encouragement. "We're with you," a man shouted. "You deserve better," a woman added, her hands still clapping. The child who had innocently questioned his mother earlier clapped louder than anyone, his small hands echoing against the thunder of adults, his voice rising high and clear. "Good job, Captain." Laughter mingled with applause at the boy's earnest cry, but the laughter was no longer cruel. It was joyful, united in justice. Michael leaned across the aisle, his voice loud enough for Clarence to hear over the applause. "You held your dignity when no one else could have. That's strength, sir. Real strength." Linda followed, her face glowing with pride. "I told you before, Judge, I studied under you. And what you taught me about justice, you just lived it again right here. Thank you." Her words carried the weight of truth, a reminder that Clarence's legacy extended far beyond courtrooms. It lived in the way he carried himself, even in the face of open cruelty. The roar of the engine softened as the plane descended through the clouds, the cabin lights dimmed to a gentle glow, and the tension that had once filled the air settled into a reflective quiet. Passengers sat back in their seats, their expressions subdued yet thoughtful, many still casting glances toward Clarence, who remained calm and composed, his eyes closed in silent meditation. The storm that had raged inside the narrow aisle had passed, its waves leaving behind the wreckage of arrogance stripped bare, but also the quiet triumph of dignity that refused to bow under cruelty. Rebecca sat near the back, her uniform creased, her face pale and blank, the weight of shame pressing on her as heavily as the seatbelt across her lap. No one looked at her now with respect. No one acknowledged her as authority. She was just another passenger, silent in her disgrace, waiting for the moment she would have to face the consequences that loomed ahead. Clarence shifted slightly in his seat, his hands folded calmly in his lap, his jacket still covering the damp shirt beneath, a reminder of the humiliation he had endured, but also the strength with which he had carried it. Michael leaned toward him once more, speaking softly now, his earlier fire tempered with admiration. "Sir, I hope you know you taught us all something today, not just about patience, but about strength. You showed us how to stand tall even when someone tried to drag you down. Clarence opened his eyes slowly, turning his head to look at the young man, and offered a faint smile. "Sometimes the best way to fight," he said gently, "is simply to keep your dignity. People reveal themselves if you let them speak long enough." Michael nodded firmly, his respect unshakable, his gaze steady as though he were absorbing a lesson he would carry for life. The landing gear touched the runway with a jolt, the plane rumbling as it slowed along the tarmac. The passengers straightened in their seats, fastening belts, gathering belongings, their eyes shifting again toward Clarence, as though unwilling to forget the man who had turned a simple request into a lesson about human decency. When the plane finally rolled to a stop and the seatbelt signs chimed off, the doors opened and daylight spilled into the cabin. Standing at the gate were airline representatives in dark suits, their faces etched with discomfort as they entered quickly, their eyes scanning until they fell on Clarence. Their movements carried urgency and guilt, their voices low but earnest as they approached him. "Mr. Johnson," one of them said, bending slightly in respect, "we are deeply sorry for what happened on this flight. This does not reflect the values of our company. We will be filing disciplinary action immediately, and Rebecca Miller will not serve another passenger until a full review is complete." The passengers who had lingered nearby to hear the words nodded in satisfaction, their anger easing as they realized justice was reaching its final form. Rebecca, pale and trembling, sat rooted in her seat, her head lowered, her pride shattered beyond repair. She made no protest, no defense. The battle she had fought so arrogantly was over, and she had lost it in front of everyone. Clarence rose slowly, his tall frame dignified even in weariness, and the representatives stepped back respectfully as he adjusted his jacket. He looked down briefly at his shirt, the faint water stains still visible, then back at the crowd of passengers who watched in silence, waiting for him to speak. His voice was low, steady, filled not with bitterness, but with the calm certainty of truth. "This isn't about the fact that I was once a judge," he said. "This is about the fact that I am a human being. Every human being deserves respect, no matter their age, their race, their title, or their place on this plane. That is what was forgotten today, and that is what must never be forgotten again." The passengers absorbed his words like scripture, their expressions softened, their eyes filled with reflection. Some clapped quietly, not with the raucous energy of before, but with reverence, as though honoring not just him, but the lesson he had carried through fire and humiliation. Linda's eyes glistened as she whispered to Michael, "This will stay with me for the rest of my life." The child, still clutching his mother's hand, piped up innocently, "He's right, Mom. Everyone should be nice, no matter what." His voice, unguarded and pure, carried into the silence like a final reminder that truth was simplest when spoken by those too young to complicate it. Clarence turned toward him, smiling softly, his eyes shining with the quiet hope that maybe the next generation would learn sooner than his own had. Captain Harris, standing near the cockpit door, watched with respect, his face solemn. He stepped forward and shook Clarence's hand firmly. "Sir," he said, his voice heavy with sincerity, "I will never forget this flight, and I will make sure neither does my crew. Thank you for the way you carried yourself. You reminded us all what leadership looks like, even when you weren't in command." Clarence inclined his head gently, his eyes steady. "Leadership isn't about command," he replied. "It's about character." The captain nodded, humbled, before stepping aside to allow Clarence's path toward the open door. As Clarence walked slowly down the aisle, passengers rose to their feet, some clapping softly, others placing hands over their hearts, all acknowledging the dignity of the man they had once watched be humiliated. Rebecca sat motionless, unable to lift her head, the sound of their respect for him a crushing reminder of her own fall. Clarence paused briefly as he passed her row, his eyes resting on her bowed head. He did not speak, did not gloat, did not sneer. Instead, he simply stopped long enough to remind her with silence that the dignity she had tried to strip from him had never belonged to her to take. Then he moved on, each step steady, his back straight, his shoulders squared, his silence louder than any condemnation could be. When he finally stepped out of the plane and into the terminal, the light struck his face, and for the first time that day, he felt the weight lift from his shoulders. He had endured cruelty and insult, but he had carried it without surrendering his dignity. And in doing so, he had shown everyone that respect is not granted by titles, but demanded by humanity. The airline representatives followed close behind, already preparing reports, already drafting apologies. But Clarence's heart was elsewhere. He thought of his grandchildren, of the stories he would tell them, of the lesson he hoped they would carry. That even when the world tries to strip you down, your dignity is yours alone, and no cruelty, no arrogance, no uniform can ever take it away if you refuse to give it up. The end. If this story has moved you, let us know by giving it a like and subscribing so you can follow more powerful stories that reveal truth and dignity in the face of injustice. Tell us what you think about the plot. Did the turning point strike you the most when Clarence's past was revealed, or when he calmly reminded everyone that every person deserves respect? Share your thoughts below and let us know where you're watching from. Your comments and reflections matter because they turn this from just a story into a conversation about how we treat one another.